Rain hammered the roof of the old manor like impatient fingers urging me to turn back, but the front door stood open, yawning into a darkness that felt aware. I hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, shaking off the cold and the uneasy feeling that the house had been waiting for me. The air smelled of damp wood and something older, something like a memory left too long in the shadows. My flashlight beam slid across peeling wallpaper and shattered picture frames, but every time I blinked, I could swear the hallway stretched just a little farther than before. There was no wind inside, yet a single door at the far end of the corridor creaked slowly, as though acknowledging my presence. I told myself it was only my nerves that made the silence feel thick, almost alive. But as I walked deeper into the house, my footsteps echoed strangely, as if someone else were pacing just half a second behind me. Then the floorboards groaned, not under my weight, but under something moving in the room above. The house seemed to breathe. And I had the unbearable sense that it knew my name. If you'd like, I can continue the story, expand characters, or adjust the tone, just let me know. The path leading to the abandoned house wound through a tangle of overgrown brush, as though the land itself wanted to conceal the structure from anyone foolish enough to seek it out. The protagonist moved slowly, each step sinking into the damp earth, feeling an inexplicable heaviness in the air. The letter they had received 3 days earlier still weighed in their pocket, a single sheet of yellowing paper with no return address, signed only with an unfamiliar name that nevertheless stirred something uneasy in the back of their mind. It spoke of a secret buried within the old family estate, a truth that demanded to be uncovered before it consumed what little remained of their bloodline. The words made little sense, yet carried a strange pull, as though they had been written specifically for the eyes now reading and rereading them. The first glimpse of the house came when the path finally opened to a clearing, revealing a massive structure slumped beneath the weight of time. Shutters dangled like broken limbs, and the paint peeled in long strips that fluttered weakly in the breeze. The windows were dark, reflective in a way that made it seem as though something on the inside watched from behind them. Ivy crawled across the stone walls like veins, tightening its grasp as if restraining a beast that might otherwise escape. Even from a distance, the house exuded a strange gravity, tugging at nerves and instinct with the subtle insistence of a whispered summons. Approaching the front steps, the protagonist sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped, not with the sharpness of weather but with the gradual, deliberate chill of something sentient. A single step creaked beneath their weight, the sound cutting sharply through the stillness. For a moment they considered turning around, retreating back down the winding path before the house noticed them fully, before the letter's vague promises became entanglements they could no longer escape. But some part of them, restless and curious, urged them onward. The door itself stood slightly ajar, as if expecting their arrival. No breeze moved it, it simply hung open, suspended between welcome and warning. Crossing the threshold required only a small motion, a lean forward, a shift of balance, yet it felt like stepping across an unseen boundary that once crossed could never be undone. Inside, the dimness swallowed the daylight, absorbing it into the stale, heavy air. The protagonist paused, listening for signs of life, but the house offered only silence, deep, patient, and watchful. The letter crinkled again in their pocket as they took another step inward, and the realization surfaced slowly that the house might have been waiting for this moment far longer than they had. The first strange occurrence crept into the protagonist's awareness so subtly that, for an instant, they wondered if they had imagined it. The air inside the house felt unnaturally thick, as though it clung to the skin, and each breath seemed to draw in a faint taste of dust and something metallic. As they moved deeper into the main hall, their footsteps echoed in a way that didn't quite match the rhythm of their strides, as if an additional set of steps lagged just behind them, always a fraction of a second out of sync. They froze, listening, but the echo faded into stillness so complete it pressed uncomfortably against their ears. Trying to dismiss the sensation, they continued forward, though the fine hairs at the back of their neck had already begun to rise. The first door they touched swung shut behind them without warning. It didn't slam, nor did it drift closed with the softness of a draft. Instead, it pressed inward with deliberate pressure, clicking shut as if the house itself had decided the door no longer needed to remain open. The sound was small but felt unnervingly intentional. The protagonist drew in a slow breath and attempted to steady their nerves, rationalizing that old houses shifted, hinges loosened, and wood warped over time. Yet no amount of logic quieted the lingering sense that the house had responded to their presence. A whisper followed next, not a voice, but the soft scrape of something brushing along the far wall of the room. The flashlight beam jerked in that direction, revealing only cracked plaster and peeling wallpaper. The noise stopped the moment the light touched the wall, as though the movement had never existed. But when they lowered the light again to inspect the floor, faint dust patterns trailed across it, subtle disturbances that gave the impression someone had moved through moments earlier, just out of sight. Another whisper drifted through the room, this one unmistakably sound rather than imagination. It was faint, so faint it could have been mistaken for a draft slipping through a hidden crack, yet it carried a tone beneath it, something that almost resembled breathing. The protagonist's chest tightened as they turned in a slow circle, trying to determine its source. The beam of the flashlight trembled in their hand. Shadows clung more tightly to the corners now, as though drawing closer in observation. The sensation of being watched grew heavier, settling on the protagonist's shoulders like a weight they could not shrug off. The stillness around them no longer felt empty, it felt crowded, as though something unseen lingered just behind the veil of dark, curious and patient, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The discovery of the sealed room began with a faint draft that shouldn't have existed. The hallway the protagonist explored was densely packed with stale air, thick enough that each breath felt filtered through years of abandonment. Yet, from behind a section of wall near the staircase, a thin ribbon of cold air brushed against their skin. It was so slight that at first they thought it was their imagination, but when they moved closer, the draft strengthened, slipping through cracks that should not have been there. The wallpaper in this section appeared newer than the rest, still peeling, but less faded, as though someone had replaced it at some point despite the house's long desertion. This inconsistency stirred a creeping curiosity that overpowered the growing unease clawing at the protagonist's thoughts. Running their fingers along the wall, they felt an unnatural seam beneath the paper, a narrow indentation hidden under the floral pattern. It didn't match the surrounding architecture, it was too straight, too deliberate, like the outline of something carefully concealed. They peeled back a loose corner of the wallpaper and revealed the faint edge of a doorframe, one not shown in any of the house's blueprints they had studied before coming. The fact that someone had taken great effort to hide it only deepened the sense that the letter's cryptic mention of a forgotten truth had been more than melodramatic warning. The doorknob, half buried under the wallpaper, was icy to the touch. When the protagonist gripped it, a vibration traveled through the metal, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present, like a pulse. They recoiled at the sensation, heart hammering, unsure whether the coldness came from the metal or something deeper within. Gathering their courage, they turned the knob, but it refused to give, locked by something more resistant than rust. It felt as though something on the other side braced against it, denying entry with quiet determination. Unsatisfied, the protagonist pressed their ear against the concealed door, expecting silence. Instead, they heard the faintest sound, like the distant dragging of fabric, or the shift of weight on an old wooden floor. It came in short movements, pausing between each one, giving the impression that whatever made the sound was aware of being listened to. Their breath caught, and they pulled back sharply, stumbling a step away from the sealed door. The draft grew stronger, slipping through the cracks with a soft whistle, almost like a whispered plea or warning. The wall felt alive with possibility and threat, and the protagonist's pulse raced with the certainty that this room, hidden so carefully, held something the house did not want uncovered. The moment the protagonist realized the house was shifting came not through a dramatic crash or a visible rearranging of walls, but through a small, disorienting detail that at first seemed like a trick of memory. They had walked down the main corridor enough times to memorize its length, 12 steps from the foyer to the archway leading into the drawing room. Yet when they retraced their path after examining another decaying photograph on the wall, the corridor stretched far beyond its original span. The archway was gone, replaced by a dim continuation of hall that smelled faintly of rot and something older, something damp and metallic. Confused, they turned around to verify their direction, but the foyer was no longer behind them. Only more hallway, identical in its peeling wallpaper and dust-choked floorboards, yet unmistakably different in its angles, as if the house had elongated itself to swallow their sense of direction. A thick unease wrapped around them as they proceeded, flashlight trembling in their hand. Each step echoed strangely, the sound bouncing back in unpredictable patterns, like the hallway absorbed and released the noise at its own discretion. The protagonist's heartbeat quickened, and with it came a subtle shift in the air, a faint groan of wood, a soft creak of something settling, but these sounds moved, traveling along the walls the way breath moves through lungs. It felt as if the house listened, inhaling fear and exhaling distortion. Turning a corner that shouldn't have existed, the protagonist found themselves facing a window that looked out into pure darkness. The glass was cold beneath their fingertips, colder than the storm outside should have made it. When they peered closer, a thin outline of their reflection stared back, but the eyes in the reflection lagged, blinking a fraction too late. They staggered away, pulse racing, and when they looked again, the window was gone. In its place stood a door cracked open just enough to reveal the faint outline of another hallway that appeared to tilt unnaturally, as though gravity had shifted sideways. A distant thud echoed from somewhere behind them, followed by a slow dragging sound, deliberate and heavy. The walls rippled almost imperceptibly, the wallpaper stretching as though something pressed against it from within. Panic surged, and the protagonist moved quickly. Any direction seemed better than standing still. But the house shifted with their fear, hallways bending, doors appearing and disappearing, staircases leading upward only to twist downward again, creating a looping nightmare of disorientation. Their breath grew shallow, and with every frantic step, the house responded like a living organism adjusting itself around the pulse of its prey. The realization settled in with chilling clarity: the house was not merely trapping them, it was reshaping itself, molding its architecture around their fear, feeding on their rising dread as easily as drawing breath. "You said." The revelation began as a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a tension that thickened the air as the protagonist stumbled into a room they didn't remember entering. It was small, nearly bare, with walls stained a deep, uneven grey, as though they had absorbed years of smoke or grief. The floorboards creaked under their weight, but not with the brittle sound of age. It was more like a sigh, a weary acknowledgement of yet another presence stepping across them. At first, the protagonist thought they were simply losing their grip on direction, but the sense of familiarity they felt, an unwelcome, bone-deep recognition, told them this room was not new. It had always been here, waiting behind the shifting hallways for them to reach it. In the center of the room lay a scattering of objects: an old locket, a child's wooden toy, a faded photograph curled at the edges. None of them belonged to the protagonist, yet each felt disturbingly connected to them, as though the house had gathered these remnants from forgotten corners of their own past. When they picked up the photograph, their hand trembled. The image showed the house itself decades earlier, pristine and imposing. In the window of the top-floor room, barely visible, stood a silhouette, an adult holding the hand of a child. A cold rush crawled up their spine as they realized that the outline of the child matched their height at the age of 5. A sudden clarity struck with the force of a memory long suppressed: they had been here before. Not in dreams, not in imagination, but physically, as a child brought briefly to this house by relatives who had whispered arguments outside their door. The sense of dread that had followed them throughout their life, the nightmares of dark hallways and shifting rooms, they weren't nightmares at all, but memories the mind had buried out of self-preservation. The house had not forgotten them. It had waited. The walls vibrated softly, a rhythmic pulse that matched the beat of their racing heart. Shadows lengthened, not in response to light but in response to awareness, to recognition. The protagonist understood then that the house was not haunted by spirits. It was haunted by itself, by the memories of everyone who had ever entered and failed to leave. The structure was sentient, a living archive of every terror, every desperate breath, every final scream swallowed by its shifting halls. It preserved these memories not as echoes but as sustenance. As the realization sank deeper, the room seemed to lean toward them, the walls drawing imperceptibly closer. The objects on the floor vibrated as if eager to attach themselves to a new history. The protagonist felt the house probe their thoughts, searching for moments to claim. In that chilling moment, it became unmistakably clear that the house intended to make them part of its memory next.